Okay,
Hey
Scott,
everyone.
do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry, I kind of preempted you a bit there. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Those of you that are in Cape Town, I hope you're staying warm. I don't know what the weather is like in other parts of the country, but Justin and I are down here in Cape Town, and it is very, very cold. So yeah, luckily we're not meeting in person tonight because we would probably see the attendance kind of drop quite considerably. Uh, cool. So I'm just going to do some quick FEDSA shout outs, just some general housekeeping before we dive into it. So, first and foremost, thanks as always to NML, who's been sponsoring us from day one. Also, IO Digital. They've also kind of been very involved for a very long time. So we just kind of always just make a point of kind of mentioning our sponsors at the start of these things. Also, for those of you that joined the hackathon over the weekend, which was at the NML offices, so they also very generously sponsored some food and so forth as well. All right. So then we also have some other events coming up. So we have an event pretty soon in about 2 weeks on micro front ends. I'm super excited about that. I've been talking quite a bit about web components recently, and I think for me, kind of like that is something that I find very interesting within kind of the whole like web components, kind of modern JavaScript kind of space at the moment. And yeah, so like specifically tonight, since we're going to be talking about a lot of like CSS, but also kind of like CSS as a language itself, not necessarily CSS as kind of compiled down from other languages. Like I think this also is very fitting to like within this concept of like micro front ends and like kind of small little discrete units of like kind of code. Yeah, so those are just some general announcements. You can follow us on Meetup. So you can just search for meetup.com, and also on there just search for Front End Development South Africa. Everything is kind of published on there, and you should be able to see all our events. Then I'm happy to hand over to Justin, have him just introduce Stephanie, and I think then we can kick it off from there.
Great, thanks, Gog, for the introduction. Right, I'm very excited to have Stephanie Eckles with us here today. If you don't know who she is, you really should. If you have any interest in CSS whatsoever, she is an author, a speaker. She runs a whole lot of community type websites, including modern CSS, Style Stage, Small CSS, Eleventy Rocks, where she speaks about Eleventy, my favorite static site generator. And yeah, Stephanie, I was just, if we could just start off with you, maybe just a couple of minutes telling us about yourself and how you got into development, maybe, and what piqued your interest in particularly in CSS, and also Eleventy, because I'll be frankly, that's an interest of mine too.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today, and hello to everyone on stream. So you kind of hit the top projects that I've sort of put out in the community over the last few years, with modern CSS.dev probably being the primary one. And my kind of web development journey, I've been a professional developer for about 15 years now. And so I also feel it pertinent to tell you that geographically, I am located in Nebraska in the United States. So I'm smack dab in the center of the United States. I'm not located on the coast. I'm not located in Silicon Valley. I grew up in a very small town. I had 20 people in my graduating class. Technology was not something that was particularly emphasized in the curriculum I had access to. So what happened for me is I did have the fortune of going to a summer camp where I was given a copy of Macromedia Flash. So just dating myself there a little bit. And originally I I was excited about the animation part. I was excited about the art side of it. I had enjoyed art as a kid, just doodling and things. I'm not a fine artist by any means, but just for fun. And so Flash was sort of my gateway into realizing making that jump from some creative skills that I enjoyed and figuring out how to put those on the web. And so Flash was my starting point. That transitioned into discovering WordPress. And I spent a decade of my career working with WordPress. I still highly recommend that as an intro path. I got my college degree in actually advertising. So again, nothing to do with development or software development, but something where I could continue to be creative. But what I did was I was able to get in my particular geographic region, I was able to get internships. We have a high volume of advertising and marketing agencies. And at that particular point in time, we were beginning to finally transition away from Flash, but these agencies still needed creative development or brochure and marketing website development. So got a huge crash course through all my years of doing that, a lot of variety of experiences. And that kind of culminated in moving to a position leading a multi-platform design system. And I did that for a couple years. And that's where I really kind of recognized this need that still existed of promoting all that CSS was capable of. I remember Flexbox landing. I remember border radius landing and what monumental, achievements those were. Like, oh my gosh, we don't have to use, spacer gifts. We don't have to use 9-slice method to make our round corners, right? So, but I recognized that through my work in that design systems where I was working with developers of a lot of different skill sets, a lot of different backgrounds, their own super varied journeys, just not being familiar with what those capabilities were. So it's been really fascinating is since I made that decision to kind of start blogging, that was the, beginning point, and where modern CSS.dev evolved from, discovering more about what those pain points are, kind of learning better to how to educate around those things. And certainly we've seen this huge explosion in the language itself in the last 3 years. So it's been kind of a cool time to decide to make that shift.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Let's talk about modern CSS Dev. It's such a great resource. And that's how I first discovered your work. I think reading, I can't remember exactly what it was I was reading about. I think it was the nth child selectors or something. I'm not sure. But as someone who's worked with CSS for a long, long time, I've also been very, very excited about the changes that we've had in the last couple of years. Have you found that you've got a lot of traction from modern CSS Dev in terms of people learning new things? Is it something that is not a secret, so to speak? Do just a bunch of CSS people know about it, or do you find that you get like a lot of people using it as a resource? Because that is such a fantastic resource for learning.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, it's got consistent traffic on it. I will tell you that the most popular articles by far are the ones around styling form controls. And that's just kind of a fascinating data point to me. It's definitely where a lot of people discover it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been, really an honor to have articles cited by, other folks in their own work and as a learning resource. So I'm always eager to know when it helps. I'm eager to know, I absolutely accept feedback if something was confusing to you or if I missed the mark on something. Maybe you discovered a bug, maybe you're aware that something could be done more accessibly. That's something I also emphasize in the series, which was another gap I was seeing in educational resources. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually leads into a question or that I was going to put to you, which I have noticed that accessibility plays a big part in the work that you do there. Like your form controls are you're very explicit. This is accessible, right? And it's just been Global Accessibility Awareness Day recently,
Yes.
which we did an event on, as we have done every year. And it's really great to see that that's something that you're very cognizant of, because a lot of the time we see controls that are styled, or JavaScript components, etc., and accessibility is not even an afterthought. It just doesn't exist. So perhaps you could just give us a little summary, perhaps, of your thoughts on accessibility, its importance, and why we should all be paying attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, something I definitely had my own journey with in fully recognizing it, its importance in my own work, alongside doing that WordPress work. We were significantly using Bootstrap at that time, and they had done their due diligence. They had, made their demos accessible, but I didn't understand what ARIA was. So I stripped it out because it seemed like just extra. I thought it was like JavaScript hookins or something that we weren't using. And so obviously I've learned a lot since then. In fact, one of my favorite articles I've written was not about CSS. It was tangential to CSS, but on Smashing Magazine, writing about when we actually need JavaScript and not just a CSS solution. So very passionate about that.
Yeah.
I've also had the great benefit of working directly with accessibility experts and having very hands-on access to them and ability to learn from them. But and the biggest advice there is just becoming more aware of it, finding out who's talking about it, speaking about it, absorbing as much as you can. It's something that does take time to learn and does take time to figure out how to incorporate. And that's why it was so important to me to include in tutorials, because like you said, it was either missing or just, sort of blatantly ignored, which may just be a gap in the education. And I can't blame people for that if we're not being purposefully inclusive of that in our education materials. So
yes, very true. Yeah, no, that is great. Something else you do that I'm really love is style stage, especially being of a certain age, where CSS Zen Garden is something I know and love. For people who perhaps don't know about CSS Zen Garden, it was, here's a content in HTML, now go and style it in however you feel like styling it and upload it. And we and so much interesting things came out of that way back then. When I can't even remember when it was. Scott, maybe you remember when CSS Zen Garden was around. Sure. It's still up as far as I know. Is it still up? I haven't looked. So when I saw that you were kind of reviving this with Style Stage, I thought, oh, that's such a wonderful idea. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with that and thought this would be a great idea, and what your aim was with it, and really how people have taken to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely been one of my favorite things to work on, and again, see kind of spread in the community, and every once in a while gain attention and get a new batch of submissions to it. So Style Stage, yes, it is fully inspired by reincarnation, if you will, of Zen Garden. It's been blessed by Dave Shea, the original creator. But the intent was to a couple of things. One, before the broadcast, we were talking about CodePen. CodePen and environments like that are excellent for honing in on a very specific micro problem. But if you are not doing formal design education or boot camps or any other place where you're being taught full page design, the only place that you may get that that opportunity is through your own portfolio, because when you join an established team, you're most of the time not doing greenfield. I had, again, a unique opportunity to do more full page because of being in that marketing environment, but that's not, the norm. And so it was mostly looking to provide that opportunity to consider a full page design, but also bring in some of our, first of all, modern CSS, and also other considerations. In the guidelines, you will find a few things related to accessibility, things related to performance. And what's been really cool is I've had several college classes in particular who have folded this into their curriculum. They actually used to use Zen Garden, and Zen Garden stopped taking submissions. I have it on the homepage there. I can't remember, quite a while ago. And so much has changed since then. Our understanding of the web, and even our understanding of semantics. And so I did make one semantic error that I'll own up to. The header there shouldn't be an H2 under the H1, but whoops, we all make mistakes. So a little caveat there, but I don't want to break folks' styling. But yeah, so it's unopinionated on classes. It's, as semantic as, I had the knowledge of doing at the time. HTML that you supply a style sheet for, you contribute it through GitHub. And another cool thing there is it has been a lot of folks' first opportunity to use GitHub, and you kind of forget that not everybody has that. Yeah. So kind of a bonus little learning there for folks who decide to do it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it ends up on the gallery. It's not I like to say it's not a beauty contest if you meet the guidelines. And, I'm happy to include it in the gallery. So.
Yeah, that's a great point you make around GitHub and getting familiar with Git, because it's such a crucial part of modern workflows. And yeah, it's not often taught anywhere, is it? It's just assumed, you'll pick it up along the way. So that's a great thing. I really love Style Stage. It's been on my to-do list for what, like 11 months. One day you'll get a PR from us.
Perfect. Looking forward to it.
I think it took both of us like 10 years to finally get a personal site up. So maybe Style Stage, maybe next 10 years.
Yep, there you go. A lot of folks have had fun, picking out a theme, something you wouldn't normally do too if you are a little bit more experienced and really taking a chance to go all in creatively. So
yeah.
So I actually see there's a specific question there, like we're getting straight into it. A specific question about Tailwind, which I think is like, I'm super curious to hear your thoughts on that. But maybe
the questions are arriving.
Yeah. So we forgot to mention that. We also forgot to mention that for those of you, I did mention it in the text chat, but I don't think we kind of officially mentioned it in the stream. Please guys, share any questions you have in the text chat. We'll just ask them as they come up and so forth. So Justin, I'm happy for you to take this one.
Stephanie, we'll just pop questions up as they come along. So Dominica, who I know, and I can confirm she is not, in fact, a cat. She wants to know if you have any thoughts on Tailwind. We see Tailwind everywhere, I think. And I think maybe a good opportunity to also ask if you have any general thoughts on CSS frameworks, as opposed to, rolling your own, creating your own design systems and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I always answer this question is, first of all, what's most important at the end of the day is to use what works for your team, use what works for your own mental model, and I would encourage folks to look into the trade-offs when you are evaluating, which you would do with anything, right? Ideally. And it's also kind of assuming that you're starting, like I mentioned earlier, a greenfield project. Again, so I like to remind that normally when you step into a team, you're not doing a greenfield project. And so in that instance, this is why I focus on the basics, the fundamentals, and also you'll find in my materials a really heavy emphasis on, flex and grid, like specifically layout methods. It's not that there's something wrong with the frameworks. There's just trade-offs when you make the decision to use them. Another thing about it that I consider is accessibility. Again, the frameworks aren't inherently inaccessible. However, when you are styling something in a Tailwind type of way, you have to make extra sure that you're accounting for example, states of buttons, states of links every single time. You have to make sure that any contrast issues are taken care of, focus is taken care of. You just have to, kind of double check that happens every time. I'm aware that there's ways that you can fold in their styles and make custom classes. But just be aware of those trade-offs. It's not a method I personally would use in my work. I like to also make folks aware that when we're talking about some of the accessibility features, another thing I like to use is to actually make use of attribute selectors, for example. And so in that way, we can sort of intrinsically tie the accessible behavior to the state of the component. And
Right. Yeah.
that's something you can't quite do. And so you end up adding different methods and extra stuff in your JavaScript instead of handling some things in CSS, because it's not like a focus or hover state that you're attaching that kind of thing to. You also miss out on other media query behaviors we have, like preference queries. I'm thinking of, there might be dark light mode. I haven't looked into it, so maybe there's dark light mode, but I don't think there's things, for example, testing, does a device have hover? Does a device, these other features that we have available in media queries. Again, very aware, you can still write those technically. You can still whip out a style sheet with those. But if you're not familiar that they exist, you're not going to do that step anyway. And so I just am advocating for general knowledge of the language, know what it offers you, know what the trade-offs are when you select a framework. Or, I mentioned earlier, I'm in design systems. So I'm absolutely not opposed to thinking of your style structurally or systematically. I'm a very big proponent of componentizing things. So yeah, just those are the considerations I have.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make around when you adopt a framework, you tend to go all in on the framework. And as you say, there might be all sorts of things that aren't in the framework that you're just not aware of. I think media queries is an excellent example that you've used there, especially around detecting for hover, detecting for touch, etc., which are such powerful tools that we have in CSS. And of course, bearing, we know now, we tended always to, a touch screen, well, that must be a mobile device, but it's, it's not. It could be any device. So those are really, really interesting considerations. Yeah. So thanks very much for that.
I've kind of come around quite a bit on this topic. So I think a couple of years ago, like I tended to be a lot more kind of a CSS purist. But I think what I've kind of realized is you actually have a lot of people writing CSS that aren't necessarily even front-end developers. So you spoke about trade-offs, So what's the trade-off there? Would I rather have like malformed, like raw CSS that has like 20 important tags and like 9 levels of selectors and just like explodes the specificity, or would I just have someone use Tailwind and it kind of almost protects them and the entire code base from them? So it's such a hard question to just answer in a vacuum.
Yes.
What I find interesting is in the early days, specifically with like this approach, kind of initially it was like atomic CSS or something. I don't know if you remember that, Justin. I don't know. Like it was like Yahoo, I think, like was the first one to kind of take this approach, and it was almost universally hated.
The first like kind of CSS framework you're talking about?
No. So this whole notion of with Tailwind, like kind of like almost having like atomic like pieces of styling instead of like pure semantic in the sense that you would have like primary button, secondary button, kind of like your bootstrap type of approach. And I think the first like team to try this was Atomic CSS by, I think it was Yahoo, and like they were just like absolutely destroyed and people hated it so much. And it's interesting to me how people kind of came around a bit with Tailwind. I don't know whether it's just kind of the culture like being a bit different, or whether they're just having a bit more of a nuanced approach or so forth. I find that extremely interesting.
Yeah, I think there's one of the trade-offs I mentioned is, do you want pre-made documentation, or are you able to maintain your own? And I know that that's a huge reason folks choose a framework.
Yeah.
Huge, huge, huge.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
you made me think of just one more little point though, on that topic of absolutely you're going to have different skill sets across your team. That said, we continue to devalue front of the front end developers. And I know that there's
mm.
efficiency issues, there's budgeting issues, there's so many reasons why that person doesn't sit on your team. I have found that those specializing front of the front end also have found their way into caring about accessibility. And when you have that person, even if you're using a framework, that person is able to help guide the team, or hopefully several people, but they're able to help guide the team to look more holistically. When you use a framework, I have observed a more tunnel vision view that you're just matching a design. You're not thinking about it holistically. You're not thinking about accessibility. You're not thinking about user preferences, or, I don't want a blanket statement that I hope somebody's thinking about it, but the outputs I usually see, I'm not observing that. So just an
Right.
observation, and something, again, I just
Mm.
encourage folks to learn more about so you can bring that skill into your teams.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that kind of the CSS expertise is devalued a lot. It isn't given the proper value. Not in my team, I'd like to say, but again, a huge generalization. But there are these spats that break out on Twitter every now and again, aren't there, between the JavaScript community and the more perhaps, I hate to use the word traditional front end community. It's a horrible artificial distinction, but it tends to go along those lines, where it's like, oh, you JavaScript developers, you just don't understand CSS. And then the JavaScript developers are like, oh, CSS is in the real language, blah, blah, blah. You know how it goes, these kind of pointless twos and fro's. And I definitely think that there is that idea that CSS is not, deep knowledge in CSS is not valued as much as it should be.
I think the thing
Right.
is, CSS seems deceptively simple.
It does, doesn't it?
It's like it's
Yeah.
only at scale where it starts becoming really tricky, and like maybe leading into that, and maybe kind of as a segue from Tailwind, I'm curious whether you kind of follow any specific methodologies, whether that kind of like be BEM or maybe even just like, so can we also just spend some time like a bit later speaking about like the at scope keyword? Man, I am excited. But yeah, I'm curious like whether you kind of hand roll your own kind of methodology in terms of how you structure your CSS, or whether you kind of make use of like existing approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I began to separate myself from, just what Bootstrap was, part of that was driven by a change in jobs, but I was kind of starting to recognize the shortcomings as well. That's when I kind of became more aware just within my own team, like, we're just building against designs. We're not looking longer field here. And so for me, my tools that I typically reach for, I'm still a big proponent and user of SAS, because then I have organization, separation of concerns and that sort of thing available to me. And then BEM would be the main. If you wanted to say I'm using a methodology, it would be BEM. But even then, it depends on the project. It depends on the scope. Depends on the team. So I have ways that I like to work on my own projects, but I been around long enough to, I want to work with the team and find whatever is successful for when I do have a team project as well. So I'm not necessarily pushing or advocating for one method. It's more, making those considerations. Are you able to, do you need documentation? Are you able to maintain it? What is the skill set of your team? Do you have more downstream users? Like, are you delivering a design system? And so you have another set of considerations if you're doing something like that. Is this going to be a vanilla static site? Is this going to end up in multiple platforms? All those things are going to change how you approach a project. So,
Right.
I have loads of
Great.
questions. Like, if no one else wants to ask
Hang on,
questions,
Scott.
I'm going to give you a bit of a break to also ask some questions.
Yeah. So, I just wanted to chat a little bit about all the things we've got in CSS in the last while. I think things changed fundamentally when we got layout properties, flex, and then later grid, and it completely changed the way we approached what we did. And now we've got subgrid on the horizon. We've got gap in Flexbox now. We've got all these things, things that we used to do for layouts that were in essence just tax, weren't they? Floats and negative margins, and then media queries coming in and targeting nth childs and clearing, and you know the story. So I don't want to talk too much about Flex and Grid. I think that's something that we've all become so familiar with now. But there's so many new things that we're now getting as well. And browser makers seem to be moving at the speed of light compared to how they moved in the past, which was glacial. So we've got all these new things. And a little while ago, we had Miriam Suzanne on chatting to us and taking us through all these new things. And of course, the one on everyone's lips is container queries, which we've been talking about for Skulk. 8-9 years maybe when it was first proposed.
I'll see it. I'll believe it when I see it like in production. Like I've
already
been heard too many
Chrome,
times as container queries.
It's already in Chrome Canary, I think, and other browsers are definitely still working on it. But what I wanted to talk about is layers. If you have any thoughts on that, and because I have to be honest, I find layers confusing in terms of how the specificity works at times, because how do they overwrite each other? Do they overwrite each other? How do you know when they're overwriting each other? Seems to be a whole lot of complications there. And I also a little bit struggling, and maybe it's just because I haven't spent enough time delving into them, what the ideal use case would be if you aren't importing a framework of some sort. Do you have any thoughts around that, or on layers and what you think they might bring to the way we write CSS in the future?
Yeah, I think layers is going to be, I think it's very exciting. I think that it will, first of all, we'll need very good browser support for that one in particular. They're working on a polyfill, but it's a very, very tricky one to polyfill. So we're going to need very solid support before we officially move to it. And you bring up a good point, is there use case for just, projects that aren't worried about like third-party styles or frameworks that don't have other ways to override? I still think it helps with that it's sort of a treat to your future self on maintenance, right? Where you've thought about these things ahead of time, in that first push, you've organized your items into, a utility layer, for example, and a reset layer. And we have some other ways to handle specificity more gracefully now, right? With where and is. Those are a starting point. And sometimes that might be sufficient. A lot of folks are using it in a way that's pretty equally sufficient for setting up either 0 or very low specificity styles. But layers is just that next evolution where you can be much more explicit about what groups of styles have the capability to take precedence over other groups of styles. So that's where the idea of layers comes into play. And you mentioned the third party. So for those that haven't looked into layers yet, you're able to use the import syntax presently. They're working on, there's an ask to add it to the link, but that is an HTML tag. So that's a different, the CSS working group doesn't have control over adding that. So it's a request. I haven't recently checked on the progress of that, but an important distinction that has to be an HTML spec change, which makes sense. So right now, if you, the way it's currently proposed is you would have to use the existing CSS import method. There's performance hit on that, but at least you would be able to name, for example, if you were bringing in whatever framework as a whole big bundle, you could deprioritize that as a layer and add your own layers to more easily override it without having to match specificity. The layers helps you out with that specific part of it. I think that there's an opportunity for, as a community, everyone to work with them, and there's going to be, I anticipate, kind of explosion of best practices come out of using layers. I'm sure there will be tweaks to frameworks where you have a layered version or not. But just like any tool, this is another thing I've picked up from Miriam Suzanne, like just because it's available doesn't mean you have to use it, right? Use it when it makes sense, when it's appropriate for your project. And that's the same with everything that's coming out, CSS or whatever else technology. So.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I guess that does speak a little bit to the appeal of the new that we tend to have a little bit, perhaps. Oh, new framework. Oh, must do this, must do that. Whereas tried and tested methods have their place very much as well in a project. We have a question from Matt, which kind of goes back a little bit to when we were talking about how you approach CSS yourself, and that was. Whoops, sorry. Let me do that again. Do you have a set of baseline styles that you use for all of your projects, or is it something that you do on a per project base?
Yes. So I for a while was using Andy Bell's Modern CSS Reset. You can Google that, find it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
He's got a great article walking through that if you haven't heard of it before. So I started with that. I have made some tweaks to it. So I run a CSS workshop with Smashing, which we have another one coming in July. And so that's kind of the only place I've currently exposed it. I don't have an article out there with my different tweaks. But if you search through some of my projects, you can find it. So it's something where it's awesome that folks like Andy have done some research to bring some of those things up to date. We don't need necessarily all these different things. I mentioned a minute ago that folks are starting to use is and where. I know I'm blanking on their last name, but Elad has done proposed a reset. I think that was on CSS Tricks that landed. Heavily relying on where. I know Adam Argyle in their recent sort of framework, not really a framework, makes heavy use of where to do resets. Again, if you're not familiar yet, where is a new selector we have that you can put a list of selectors inside of it. So it's within parentheses, and those will all have, the whole rule will remain at 0 specificity. So that's the benefit. That's why someone would choose it. And I think that's very interesting. I've incorporated it into a few of my rules. It just depends, again, on the project. And I think the more you take time to practice CSS, once again, as with anything, the more you kind of can recognize which rules are going to bring value, which rules are going to cause harm. And I will say where and is have been really handy where if I do hit a snag that I didn't anticipate, that can often be a solve, where it still is it is a practical baseline, but I'm able to make, more easily without bumping up specificity, make modifications later. So yeah, check out Andy's. That's a good starting point if you haven't looked at resets for a while, but learning about the is and where might be another good tool for you.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Stephanie. I just posted a link to that interview with Elad. It's on CSS Tricks in the chat. People go and check that out. It's a fascinating discussion there. Can I ask you about Eleventy away from the CSS? Okay, I'm going to be frank. This is me now. Being selfish with the question. So as Skulk, and he always laughs at me, I used to use Jekyll to run my personal website for many years, way too many years than I perhaps should have been doing, but never got around to changing it.
Which is 1 year.
Yeah, thanks. And then I was like, okay, I need to change this. It takes forever to build. It's nasty to deploy, blah, 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 blah. And I started looking around for static site generators. And I've been following Zach Leatherman for a while, all his, in particular, typography work that he'd done on font loading and all those kinds of things. And then I discovered Eleventy, and I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I can do whatever I like with this. I can use whatever language I want. I can build it however I want. There's a whole bunch of plugins I can use. And because I built my previous site in Liquid, it was trivial to switch it over. So yeah, those are kind of my Eleventy rocks, as you say, reason. Perhaps just talk a little bit about Eleventy and what drew you to it and why you think it's a great solution for, if you're going to do a personal site, it's absolutely perfect for that, but it has a lot of more powerful applications as well. I know you've written a lot about integrating various things with it.
Yeah, for sure. It is definitely my second favorite topic. Sometimes first, depending on the day. So just something that, so I mentioned my history with WordPress. So I had left the team that I, was working with WordPress on to do the design system role. And then I was like, oh, I want to redo my portfolio, the age-old story, right? And I was like, I no longer am that attached to WordPress. It feels heavier than what I want for this. And also, I kind of left WordPress right before Gutenberg landed, and I wasn't really interested in learning something actually new in that realm if I wasn't going to stick to it as a technology. That's the main reason for me personally. But so I started to see Eleventy get more chatter in my particular social media network. Looked into it, very much like the idea. I should also say, so in my design systems role, I sort of wound up as a React developer for 2 years and built our design system documentation site with Gatsby. So that was my re-intro, I should say, to the idea of static site generators. And so I liked Eleventy where it was way lower overhead, zero JavaScript by default in terms of the output to the client. And so I just picked it up. I had started writing modern CSS on the dev.to community. And so my very, very first project, I actually live tweeted this because that's a thing people sometimes do. I did of trying out Eleventy. And within about 4 hours, I had something up and running, and that was including a fetch out to dev.to to pull in those posts. Yeah. So that was the first version of modern CSS. I basically used that as a headless CMS. So I was kind of smashing together some more advanced skills. I didn't really need to do that for the first time of trying it. But that kind of exploded into me getting more interested. So if you haven't looked into Eleventy, it is a static site generator. It's considered part of the quote unquote Jamstack. But you can start out with it where it essentially just helps you smash together your files with a layer of templating, whether that is strictly HTML, but you can kind of build up to using Markdown if that's what you enjoy writing. And then there's 10 total templating language. So the ones I usually use are Nunjux, Markdown, and then HTML. And so the benefit is you can define a layout, and you don't have to keep copying and pasting that. That's your baseline kind of improvement there. But then you just can layer on functionality and features as you need them. If you only ever write Markdown, or you only ever write HTML, but you just take advantage of that layout behavior I mentioned, that's completely fine. It builds incredibly fast. It pushes out, like I said, fully static files. Folks have built, different starters. So WordPress and other tools, you might be accustomed to themes. It's not wholly a concept in Eleventy right now. So some folks have made starters. So you have more of the full kit that you're cloning down typically, and which may or may not give you styles. It might just give you mostly the functionality to do things a particular way, like include a JavaScript bundler. So it's, like you said, it's very open to whatever architecture you need. Can be as simple as or as complex as you would like it. And I should also mention, so Zach recently, the creator, he works for Netlify, and they recently also allocated for him to essentially work on it full time. And the biggest benefit in the last month or so has been that Eleventy now works with their Edge functionality. So now not only do you have a static site, but you can add, for example, user authentication and still not have a client-side JavaScript bundle, which I personally think is super cool.
Yeah, it's
That
really
Edge,
huge. Yeah.
Edge functions.
And there's serverless as well.
I have been having so much fun with those.
Yes.
3 million in the free plan. Wow. Like, I'm just like sending functions all over the place.
Yes. Same. It's an addiction. Yeah.
Am I Netlify just launched a new website. Am I correct that they're using Eleventy for that? I seem to think I saw that somewhere.
So the older one was using Eleventy, as far as I know.
Eleventy and Vue, they built kind of some Vue, I don't know what the right word is, adapters, or I don't know. I don't use Vue, so but yeah, it can be used with. You can add your framework. It doesn't have to mean
that's the other thing. Yes. Yeah. It's so versatile, really.
Sure, this is nice. I have a question, and I want to ask it before I get sidetracked, because there's just so much to unpack here. But I'm also curious on Justin's take on this. So this is something I've been thinking about a bit, but I haven't really articulated or kind of asked a lot of people. So I have been having a lot of fun, maybe the last year, with kind of JavaScript, kind of the types, the module, so the native like ESS module like support becoming more of a thing. So which led me to start going back to using CSS imports again, or considering them. And obviously, so I come from a world where best practice was considered that you don't use the native CSS imports, because SAS, you rather use a SAS one, and it concatenates everything for you into one big file. But because I'm now like kind of using JavaScript more like as is, without some type of bundler or whatever, and just actually doing HTTP requests for those, I've started like kind of splitting up some of my CSS as well. How bad, am I doing a bad thing, or like is that not as much an issue as it used to be?
Last I knew, which was pretty recently, because it was when I was having discussions with Miriam about layers, there is still a performance cost for import versus if you want to add several links. I think at least one of the reasons has to do with caching in your browser. And so, that import's going to have to go do a fetch every time your style sheet gets processed, to my knowledge. That was a pretty recent conversation in terms of at least, yes, there is still performance cost there. Now, if you're not fetching out to literally the whole entirety of a external framework and you're fetching out to, an already optimized file that you're in control of, that's going to, a little bit different story. I would say just benchmark that and check it out and see if it's problematic for you. I would say that if it is a JavaScript heavy app, CSS might not be where your performance bottleneck lives if you are seeing a performance hit. So again,
so there's two. So obviously, I actually mostly work within the kind of I almost want to say software in the browser world. So it's very rare that like kind of in my day-to-day like 9 to 5 work, I actually write like raw CSS, like most of it is like styled components or whatever. But then obviously you get stuff like the actual FedSA website or my personal website, which is like very like you're talking about 3 kilobytes, or whatever. And there, like to me, then something like SAS is maybe overkill. So yeah, like it's just curious to me because there's almost like a part of me that kind of doesn't want to do that because it's been drilled into me so much that it's bad. But I'm also wondering to what degree HTTP 2 kind of addresses some of those issues as well. But I guess the difference here would be that CSS is inherently render blocking, whereas JavaScript isn't. So you can lazy load JavaScript through kind of modules that get imported through HTTP natively. Yeah, I don't know. It's just like, I'm not a fan of having a 50,000 line CSS file. So like it just doesn't seem right having to choose between that or actually pulling in an entire build process just so I can have my CSS in separate files.
Yeah. Interesting point. And I would say if you, anytime you're hitting something where you are, it's a problem you've run against, you've maybe done some actual work to think about what is an alternative here. Maybe that's not exactly a perfect example, but I will say that because this was new information to me, the CSS working group has all of their in progress issues on GitHub. You can go there, you can comment on them, you can, give a little reaction to show your support of things and see where different projects are at. And maybe, I don't know if there is, but maybe there's an issue related to improving import, or maybe at least there's a discussion. I've done this a few times. I've found a discussion at least that helps me better understand why that behavior is the way that it is. Maybe there's some browser rendering stuff that it's just, again, not the CSS working groups purview to update necessarily. But I would encourage folks to check that out. You can actually go ahead and propose your own issues too, particularly if you have a, thought through solution to kick off the conversation.
And I guess not to kind of like go on to too much of a tangent, but like this is something that like I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm trying to kind of get as much value out of it as possible. Is I guess you can also offset a lot of that caching things with things like service workers and so forth, where you might lose that caching from using the link tag in HTML and so forth. Cool. Go ahead.
Thanks, Go. We're getting close to only 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any more questions for Stephanie, please post them in the chat. Stephanie, I just wanted to maybe end with asking you what's exciting you the most in what we might get in CSS soon.
Yes. Definitely container queries is top of the list for me. I've written about that a few times. And if anybody attended Hover Conference, I got to speak about that too, show off some demos. So yeah, that's top of the list for me. But I'm also
Mm.
excited about, so there's tons of stuff related to color that's on its way. But I personally am like, cool, we can have a hotter pink, but that's not exciting to me. What's exciting to me is the ability to have the browser select the appropriate color for color contrast. That's really awesome.
Mhm.
And the other
Yeah.
one is the color function where you can transform from one color notation to another. And in that process, the more key part of that process is you can, for example, change the hue or saturation or lightness and things of that nature in the browser. That is, besides organization, that's a huge reason I still use SAS is for the color functions. So I'm very
Yeah.
excited for that
Very
to come.
powerful.
Super powerful for design systems, for all these things that I mentioned earlier. Like a lot of these concerns are beginning to be alleviated. So very cool. Excited for support of those. Some of the things that recently landed, I'm still excited about. You mentioned Flex in or Gap in Flexbox, a very exciting development.
Mm.
Aspect ratio has been huge in my
Yes.
toolbox as well.
Yeah.
Another one that for some reason I don't think a lot of folks know exists. Well, two of them, the marker selector. So short version of that is you can change the color of bullets
Yeah.
and a few other properties on lists. But it also applies to, for example, the details element. So there's a couple other elements that have markers, and also accent color. So the ability with one property to change the usually the selected sort of state for radios, checkboxes, progress, and range sliders right now. So just these things that literally in one line eliminate so many hacks and
Yes.
eliminate categories where we usually get accessibility wrong too. So
Yeah. Accent color is, wow, it's a game changer, that one. After so many years of not being able to influence inputs, really, those inputs in any meaningful way.
Yes.
Without, as you say, a bunch of hacks that introduce other issues.
Yes.
Okay. Skulk, do you have a final question?
Yeah. Let me just drop
I knew you would.
Constructible style sheets. I don't know if you have any strong feelings about that, or whether you've actually delved into that much.
It's not ringing a bell as a term, so I'm not sure if I've worked with it or not.
So it's mostly in JavaScript to. So at the moment, so obviously, so we have the DOM in HTML, and you can kind of directly mutate the DOM, and you can kind of directly modify kind of the elements in the HTML via the DOM interface. We don't necessarily have that for CSS to that degree. So if you want to maybe like add new CSS to the page or whatever in terms of the cascade, not directly inline style on elements, like there isn't really much control. The only way to actually do that would be to actually put a piece of CSS inline in the HTML that gets parsed and then added to the CSS like object model. So constructible style sheets is kind of, I think it's behind a flag in Chrome at the moment. Essentially just a more pragmatic way to kind of control CSS and the kind of CSS object model and so forth. Okay. But yeah, it also kind of, I guess it's more kind of in the circles that I move in, specifically in the world of web components, where you still have to do that inline style element thing in the shadow DOM. In those spaces, I'm finding this really like exciting because it seems like you still have to do a lot of gross things within those worlds to get actual cascading CSS in your kind of CSS object model.
Yeah, interesting. I'll have to look into that more. I've built precisely one web component, and that was, well, one for fun, and then because I'm such an Eleventy stan, created an Eleventy starter for doing web components because the styling was such a pain. I didn't like how to do it. So you can search that up and you can correct how it's doing it, because that was my first stab, and I still don't know much about web components, but so if it improves the styling, I definitely need to check that out.
I also think like it's one of those things that it's kind of it provides a nice set of like browser primitives that a lot of like frameworks and things are probably going to plug into instead of like a lot of gross things that kind of get like inlined in the HTML and so forth.
Yes, I'm all for moving things native. So if it makes sense, so
yeah. Yeah, agreed.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Skulk. Yeah, we've reached the end of our time. I just want to say thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us, giving us of your time, and for the fascinating discussion. I urge everyone to go and have a look at the work that Stephanie does. We've pasted all the links to those in the chat. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that you also live stream on Twitch. So if you want to watch, follow along with Stephanie as she does some live stream stuff on Twitch, you can also find that link via her website. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed it. As usual, the YouTube video will be available for rewatch in around 24 hours. So you can see it there. And if you enjoy it and if you watch it, please share it. We need more people paying more attention to CSS, in my opinion. More views on the CSS videos than the JavaScript videos is my goal. So. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
So
Don't forget to join us.
Maybe I can sneak in a sneaky quick question there in the end to end this off. So I'm not going to let you go that easily. So you spoke quite a bit about kind of, is, and we spoke about kind of layers and so forth. For the average person, like people who don't actually read the spec, for kind of entertainment. In other words, people like not like Justin and me. What would be a good resource to kind of like get a sense of like what are the things that are coming, kind of a bit of an overview of like some of these kind of new kind of level like selectors and so forth. That's maybe a bit more digestible.
Yes.
I don't know if you have any resources.
Since we're short on time, I'll give you. I wrote about this a few months ago, talking about a few different ways that you can check that out. Folks to follow, newsletters, and I also linked to the CSS working group, GitHub, and other resources. So that hopefully is a starting point if you're interested in that.
I'll put that in the description of the video once it goes up.
Okay. Great. Thanks for joining, everyone. Next week, micro front ends. And we're also going to have another hackathon for the other radio coming up, which is going to be a UX and UI focused one. So look out for that as well. Thanks again.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.